back. Thank you for this. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dwight. Thank you. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. It's wonderful to be back. It's a great pleasure to be with you once again. And let me say again how much I appreciate the assistance of the foundation and the warmth of the congregation. Let me begin talking about this on the way over this morning with a Hebrew word. The word is saphon. Saphon is the Hebrew word for north. And it apparently comes from a root which means to be undisclosed, mysterious, far off, covered. Among the non-Israelite peoples of ancient Canaan, it was commonly assumed that Saphon, the far Saphon, is where the gods lived. I would guess that was because mere mortals are not made for the far Saphon. I cannot imagine Baal, the god of the ancient Canaanites, riding around with jumper cables. I think that the divine is perhaps better cut out for this stuff than we are. I could go for a modest balcony overlooking the Baha'i Gardens in Haifa this morning. I don't need Eden, although that's where we're headed. And that was on my mind as I made my way over this morning. So, last time we began by talking about what books can and cannot do very well. The degree to which, as people of biblical faith, we are both inspired and informed by the books and by the book, and in some respects limited by what books can do. Living communities of biblical faith learn early on that their vitality, their ongoing durability depends on grappling not only with what books have to tell them, but what must be discovered in the light of that written record only and through our experience. And that led me to some observations about the way in which I look forward to studying the opening chapters of Genesis with you. First of all, about the nature of the Hebrew language and the difficulties that ensue when a book is not only frozen on the page, locked between the covers, but in another language, separated from us not only by cultural differences and boundaries, but thousands of years and thousands of miles. The ways in which being cautious, sober about what translation does to language is simply a rule of the road in reading Hebrew Bible. I gave you a couple examples. I'll just go back very briefly to one of them that I suggested was important to keep in mind. And that is that in biblical Hebrew, verbs dominate, but they tend to be verbs, almost always verbs, of discernible action. In the biblical world, when things get done, they get done in very concrete material ways. And there is no complementary verb of being that would suggest the possibility that something simply is apart from what it actually does. To be actual is to be acting. That makes sense? To be actual is to be acting in biblical Hebrew. And like our dear departed friend Bella, the fire-bellied toad, not to act is not in terms that would come from a language with verbs of being. Not to act is to not be. The question is pretty easy that Shakespeare poses, to be or not to be. Well, let me see what you're doing and I'll let you know. That's how biblical language works. You might even say, and I think this is a stretch, but I think it's a worthwhile stretch to consider, what Indo-European languages mean by being, when it's raised to the level of a philosophical construct, what Plato saw in being, in isness, in existence, apart from action, the biblical thinker would be hard put to distinguish from death. To simply be, eternally ising, would at best come to a biblical thinker as something like, do you mean dead? Now that's very important to keep in mind. We're not going to be doing the burning bush this time around. But one of the more egregious examples of how you can go wrong in translation is, in biblical Hebrew you can't say I am that I am. Can't say it. That translation was a tendentious translation based on thinking tutored in Indo-European languages, in which being seemed to be the most elevated form of what, well, we only have words of being to describe it, what is. And in that respect, you miss entirely the import of what God actually says to Moses when Moses says, what's your name? Now, I'm going to leave that for a moment on the table. But it's going to be quite different, right? So if you've struggled all your life to grasp the conundrum, the puzzle of what could be meant by I am that I am, you are now hereby freed of that responsibility. Because it wasn't as it was, and it isn't as it is. So then what is it? So we'll come back to that in just a moment. We also talked about the common structural characteristics of biblical narrative, the ways in which biblical narrators typically tell their stories. Another way of saying this is, what were the conventions that were understood to be commonly assumed by original biblical listeners about the stories that they were being told? The most important of these conventions, as I mentioned last week, is that biblical listeners assumed that the greater part of any narrative, and the deeper the narrative, the more this was true, the greater part of any narrative was unspoken. That it was the responsibility of the listener to appreciate the full range of implications, of possibilities that come with the language of the narrative, and to engage in the process of working out those possibilities, those unspoken, those implicit possibilities based on their own experience. That one must be actively involved in making sense of a biblical narrative. The story is told that way, repeatedly. Obviously, in some cases, more subtly in others, but all the great biblical narratives, all of the pivotal biblical narratives in Hebrew Bible are important only to the extent that we consciously appreciate what the narrator isn't saying. So we're going to come back to that point. And finally, that pattern repetition is a constant feature of the biblical narrative style. The repetition of key words and phrases long after they've exhausted their capacity to inform helps to direct the thinker along the way, a listener thinking about the text, along the way of possible exploration of those unspoken implications. Listening for, as Buber said, the Leitworten, the lead words of a biblical text, often helps you to wend your way through those implicit possibilities. Okay, so that's what we did last time. And then I closed with just a very brief series of observations about what's distinct regarding the first 11 chapters of Genesis. How they are, by and large, different from anything else that you find in the Hebrew Bible. I said the only other place where you find an extended narrative different in the same way as the book of Job. And I just want to repeat what I observed in that regard. Hebrew Bible is almost entirely uninterested in what goes on in the tzapon, that place where only gods are. Now, in the ancient world, as I said, one of the great attractions of myth, one of its primary purposes was to open a window on what gods do when they're not messing with us. And in the ancient world, that was a much bigger story. That was a much more important story than what gods might do when they're interacting with human beings. In the Hebrew Bible, distinctively, significantly, it's the other way around. Not only are biblical narrators almost entirely uninterested in anything other than when God comes looking for us, but it's peculiar to the biblical tradition that this God comes looking for us over and over again. This is a tradition in which the divine is deeply interested in people. Goes so far as to love people, to not get enough of us, to be unwilling to disengage, to come to the brink, and then constantly come back for more of the frustrations that come with dealing with human beings. As Abraham Joshua Heschel said, this is a tradition of God in search of man. There is no great questing for God in the Hebrew Bible. There is a great questing by God for the human. And that means almost everything of significance in the Hebrew Bible is going to take place in the world where we live. We meet God in our world, except for the first 11 chapters of Genesis. In that respect, as I said, it comes closer to what in classical sources was understood to be the mythic God-telling than most everything else in the Hebrew Bible, and that sets these first 11 chapters apart. As I said, it's therefore worth considering seeing the first 11 chapters of Genesis not as the necessary beginning of a story, but the author's prologue. And you can understand author with a capital or a lowercase a. This is the foreword for the book that in many respects begins chapter 12 of Genesis. Any questions or comments about any of that? Have you been ruminating about that over the last week or so before I go on? Yes, please, Pastor. Good morning.
Good morning. So, and this is probably a whole different topic for you, but how do the Hebrews come up with this different perspective? I find it fascinating, this distinctive disinterest in what's going on in God's house up there.
Yes.
Whatever God's doing. And maybe you don't have time for that, but
Well, it's a wonderful question. It's a wonderful question. And it's a wonderful question because it seems to be everything we know about the way to validate information tells us that that can't be. That there has to be a causal relationship that's discernible on the basis of other analogous situations. And the possibility that we're talking about a non-analogous situation is deeply unsettling or revelatory.
Yeah.
You know, for our ancestors, say, what do you mean? It's different because it's different. That's the point.
Right.
The tip of this iceberg is the biblical notion of idolatry. That idea, which is distinct in and of itself, is linked down deeply to the question of how could it possibly be different. I'll tell you what I typically say, Pastor. If I were pressed to provide a basis, I would say that might stand the kind of conventional criticism that would be leveled at such an assertion. I'd say, I think it is somehow linked to the social and political marginality of the people who originated this tradition. It has something to do with the repeated references to the fact that this was the most unlikely of occurrences, that the people who became biblical Israel would understand themselves as bearing this sort of historical significance. And that every odd idiosyncrasy about the biblical tradition comes from that original marginality. That's where I would start. What Walter Brueggemann refers to as the radical reversal of biblical tradition. That if the social origins of the people defy the odds, then anything else might also be possible. Do you like that?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's my best. There was a thinker, a Jewish biblical scholar, quite influential in the mid-20th century, a man by the name of Yechezkel Kaufman, who wrote a 6-volume history of biblical Israel that was easily abridged to 3 volumes. And you can get a fine version of Kaufman's Biblical Israel in 1 volume in English. Kaufman doesn't hazard a theory as to why it's different, but he bets the farm on the idea there is no precedent for what one finds in the Bible. There really, really isn't, and leaves it to the reader to draw whatever conclusions they might choose regarding why not. Kaufman does a fine job of saying, unlike anything else. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, well, let's go on to the text itself. First chapter of Genesis describes for us a series of creative acts. And the creator, the origin of these acts, is first recognized in the actions themselves that form the world as humans know it. That is to say, there's no other introduction of this creator than the creation. And for a long time, those who have read this text carefully have meditated on that distinctive introduction. That alone confirms, I think, to a great extent, what we've been saying about the nature of biblical language. Here we have a narrative that reiterates in story form a grammatical principle. And that is, you want to know God as creator, watch the creation. There is no other once there was a God. This is, behold the God. Eche theos, behold the God here. There is no other meeting of this God other than in the ensuing creative action. And that is, I think, the subtle but significant difference between the old King James translation, in the beginning, and the now far more common, at the beginning of God's creating art. The debate about what those first few words of Genesis actually indicate is old. It goes back to the Middle Ages. And on the face of it, it might seem an unnecessary digression. But embedded in the significance between those two possibilities is a world of implications. So let me say it to you again. King James translates the beginning of the book of Genesis as we all know, in the beginning. And what that suggests is, when we imagine that, we see a timeline. The timeline starts with a point. We're all back in geometry. We're thinking of our geometry teachers. There's a point and there's a ray. And we are being taken back to that point, and now we are to follow the ray through creation and onward. In the beginning. Already in the Middle Ages, there were those who contended that could not be the proper construction of those opening words. And the word that is translated in King James as created was understood by a significant number of medieval commentators in the Hebrew as being a gerund. That it wasn't a past tense verb, it was in the beginning of the creating, God did this. The difference being that now you have a way of understanding the relationship between time and the initial creative acts that's in harmony with how Hebrew Bible tenses work. So let me tell you a little bit about tense in the Hebrew Bible in classical biblical Hebrew. You and I are used to the idea that tense, as the term suggests, has to do with time. And it's a way of indicating pieces of time. That time is a continuum, and that there's a piece of it here that we call past, and a piece of it here that we experience as present, and a piece of it here that we call future, and that language follows those divisions. That things happen in the past, things happen in the present, and things will happen in the future. And the fact that I use a helping verb of being, or will happen in the future, might signal that when you get to the Hebrew, it's a little different. It looks like Hebrew tenses work like this. There are some things done that are not being done anymore. And there are some things done that are being done as I speak. And there are some things to be done that have not begun to be done yet. Those are the three basic tenses in Hebrew. So in order to determine the tense, you ask, what's the condition of the action? Instead of saying, when did it happen, you ask, is it still happening, or has it not yet begun to occur? It's a very, very different way of thinking about time, but it works perfectly with the alternative translation of the opening words of Genesis, which then would be, this has to do with when the actions of creation were underway. It doesn't have to do with another time, which is in the past. It has to do with actions which were then underway. What that has to do with the past is left to our imagination. All we know is that the story brings us and God's creative actions together, and in those actions we meet God when those creative actions ensue. That distinction makes sense. Does that make sense to you? So we're talking now not about the beginning of time. The Hebrew Bible isn't interested in the beginning of time. The biblical Hebrew doesn't exactly have good language for describing what we would mean by the beginning of time. Time isn't something that has a beginning. There are only actions that begin. So what we're looking for is when those actions begin, and that's when the Hebrew Bible begins as well. That's when the story begins. Not the beginning of time, but the beginning of the creating actions.
And theologically, it's a whole different world when you say when God began.
Why would it be
Suggests
different?
it continues on.
Yes, yes, yes.
As opposed to the other one being defined in the past.
Right, with a kind of past time that once again takes us to a timeline. There's nothing like that in biblical language. Timelines are not part of the construct of time in biblical language. Good. So let's go a little further in the text. From the outset, this passage, and we'll look a little more carefully at it in just a second, these opening verses of Genesis, even at its maximally mythic, and maybe this is what you meant, prove ill-suited for theology. The Bible isn't odd place to do theology. Yeah. If we take these texts seriously, these opening texts were already presented with an avoidance of what would typically be the groundwork for theological exposition. One can see instead in the creation, in these opening verses, the first example of the biblical frame of reference. Even here, we meet God not as God is, which is what theology attempts to explain, but God in search of a world. The first moment of encounter is God acting for a world. Not, I am what I am, but, as is probably the better translation of what Moses is told at the burning bush, and a better complement to what we're about to read in the opening verses of Genesis, I'll come about as I'll come about. And in this particular case, as the root of the word for creation, the word we translate as creation suggests, ba, with a glottal stop here, so you have the, ra, and essentially a silent letter, as that root suggests, coming about through a definitive act. Second word in the Hebrew Bible, as well as the third word in the Hebrew Bible, cannot be effectively translated. Here's why. The first word in the Hebrew Bible is when began, or at beginning. This word, bero, if we understand it as a gerund, is what we translate as create, or creating, or creation. That word in the Hebrew Bible never has a subject other than God. God is the only grammatical subject that takes create as a predicate. Now, you and I live in a world where create is used all the time to describe all sorts of actions that have all sorts of subjects, most importantly us. If my child came home with a report card, and in the notes from my child's teacher it said, "This is a very creative child," I'd say, "Wow, that's a great thing. This is a creative child. That's creative writing. That's a creative, insightful story. Oh, we've created new technologies. People create all the time. We use that word in English all over the place." The best you can do with the definition for this word in Hebrew is, this is the definitive act of God that people don't do. So, to the extent, and we just know that because we never get that verb. We never get that verb in the Bible. And you don't get it in post-biblical Hebrew for a long, long time either. The echo of the biblical significance of the term is long-lasting. In biblical Hebrew, people can love, people can redeem, they do these things all the time. People can save or rescue, these are all terms commonly associated with God. God is said to do these things, and we have analogous action. Oh, God loves, we love. God redeems, oh, we redeem too, that we understand. God saves, yes, we save or rescue, we understand that. God forms, oh, we form too. God does this, we don't do that. We don't do that. So, as we meet this God, we begin to see verbs accumulate that describe things that we do, mighty things that we do, important, central things that we do as God does them. And on the basis of that analogous action, we get a sense of how to meet God in action. But not this. We don't do this. So whatever that means in the biblical narrative, it's important when you hear the word create in these opening verses, I think it's important to keep in mind it's not anything like anything you and I ever do. The third word, of course, is God. And the problem with God, well, we'll just leave that to future verses to come. At any rate, 3 words into the text, at least 2 out of the 3 words are difficult, if not impossible, to adequately define. Now, having said that, there is, however, much in these opening verses of creative actions that seem to be open to thoughtful human exploration. Not some of the actions in essence themselves, at least their cumulative effects. So I want to talk about that with you for just a moment. And then before we conclude today, talk a little bit about the famous distinctions between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. So that's where we're headed. Much has been made of these distinctions. In fact, the Hebrew Bible begins with 2 disparate creation narratives. And those distinctions, I think, are well worth considering. But I'd like to look at Genesis 1 and then Genesis 2, more properly speaking, Genesis 1 through 2:3, and then 2:4 through chapter 3 of Genesis, a little more carefully, and in the spirit of Martin Buber and Franz Rosenzweig's translation of Bible, in which they suggest that the kinds of distinctions that are commonly noted, often in juxtaposed passages of the Bible, where it looks like you have 2 irresolvably different versions of a single event, warrant far more careful consideration as a unit than is often allowed. And that we at least grant this, that the differences we see between the first and second chapters of Genesis were at least as apparent, at least as obvious, to those who were responsible for putting those texts side by side as they are to us. Now that's a simple observation, but let me say this again. 150 years ago when people started saying, oh, did you notice that Genesis 1 describes creation really differently than Genesis 2? It's as if nobody's ever seen that before. Nobody's ever noticed that. And that those who were responsible for putting Genesis 1 next to Genesis 2 were such poor storytellers that they had no idea what they were doing. That seems to be the premise of much of contemporary historical critical research. So Buber and Rosenzweig say, at least grant those original narrators this much space. They saw it too. So then the far more interesting question becomes, and why do they let the contradictions continue? Just as I said last week, how did it happen that those folks responsible for the formation of the New Testament canon weren't utterly undone by the possibility that people were going to say, why do we need 4 versions of Jesus' story? Isn't that a problem? Well, apparently, there have been people for a long, long time who have said, that's not a problem, that's a necessity, and potentially an opportunity. So, let's look at that in terms of Genesis 1 and 2. It behooves us, I think, to ask with some humility, why are these texts side by side? Which leads us to the third of the common characteristics of biblical narrative that I've noted on the sheet. And that is that when you read Hebrew Bible carefully, it's often worth asking, why a given passage is in fact adjacent to other passages that appear perhaps in some way to disrupt rather than complement the flow of the narrative as a whole. Why would you do that? Why would a storyteller consciously disrupt what would seem to be the most obvious flow of the narrative? Could there be an underlying purpose in that juxtaposition? Well, let's see if we can find it here. If I asked you, simply on the basis of your own familiarity with the opening chapter of Genesis, for a lead word, as Buber used the term, a leitmotif, a repeated term or phrase, repeated to the extent that it's clear that at some point it's not there for the sake of information, it's there structurally, like the chorus in a song. You don't keep singing the chorus because you're telling us any more information. You're singing the chorus for the purpose of maintaining the structure. Is there such a lead word in the opening chapter of Genesis?
Good.
Good. Okay. Very good. Now, here are the three characteristics of good that I think you can meet in the opening verses that only become clear if we take the juxtaposition as an interesting intersection between Genesis 1 and 2 rather than some kind of hastily patched together arrangement of disparate texts. First of all, I think that in a moment we'll see that in these opening verses of Genesis we get an idea of what the difference is between good and the absence of good. We're also going to get an idea of what the difference is between good and very good. And before we're done, we're going to see the difference between good and not good. So, absence of good, very good, good, not good. I think we're used to thinking that at the end of each of the days of creation, we're told that whatever God made on that day, or more properly, whatever God created on that day, God saw to be good. We're going to put aside for a moment the word saw. Let me ask you, can you find in those opening verses of Genesis the exception? Which day is it? The second day. Good for you. How did you know that already?
Just read it again.
The second day is not good. Now, once again, you can say, well, someone made a mistake. What if we don't say someone made a mistake? What if we say that the use of the lead word good in the opening verses of Genesis is very carefully crafted? And as Buber and Rosenzweig also note, a variation or divergence from a pattern repetition is often the key to the repetition as a whole. So is there anything different about the second day of creation from all of the other days that might suggest why it doesn't get its own good?
Separation.
Oh, that's wonderful. I like it, but it's not the common response. Separation is a negative, or the implication was it's nice. It's actually kind of related to the more common comment on the absence of good in the second day. Anybody see any difference between what goes on the second and third day?
It wasn't complete yet?
Yes, that's the difference. If you look at where the good does appear next, the second good in the narrative appears in the middle of the third day, and it's commonly observed that it appears in the middle of the third day because the act that begins in the second day isn't completed until the middle of the third day. Now, why it's not completed in the second day is an interesting question. But for our purposes, at least for the moment, let's work on the assumption that good has something to do with whole. Finished, complete, and whole. It has something to do with wholeness. Now, very good appears only once. And where does that appear?
6:8,
And it comes at the
after the creation of human beings.
and the end of the acts of creation, except for the creation of,
That
which is the creation of non-creation. The only thing left on the seventh day is the creation of non-creation. But at the end of the sixth day, we have very good. So let's follow the idea that good in biblical Hebrew, and in this particular context, has something to do with complete or whole. What would very good then add to good that we hadn't known yet? Yes, please.
Bigger completion.
It could simply be a larger scale or a more complete complete. Does that make sense? A more complete complete. Yes, please do it.
Well, if you view it in the sense of an integration,
Yes.
somehow everything is together, that is sort of a more complete completion.
Yes, that's right. If we're thinking of complete as things as completed within themselves, that's quite different than complete among themselves. And that the very good would have something to do with the greater whole as an integrated process. And that it works together in some way. Did you want to add that?
Well, just that they talked about food and breath, that there's a sustainability.
Yes.
That exists now on the sixth day that wasn't there before.
Yes, and we know that in fact is probably what is meant here, because there's one other place foreshadowed in this passage in which an act something like creation leads to someone looking, seeing that it is good, and investing in keeping it going. Does anyone know where that is? It only happens one more time, but the illusion is unmistakable. Something like a creative act follows with someone saying, good, and I'm going to do what I can to keep it going. This can work. It's durable. It's actually Exodus chapter 2, verse 2. Then there was a Levite man who married a Levite woman. She became pregnant. She bore a child. She looked and she saw that he was good. So she hid him. It's the same root as Saphon, the north. So she hid him for 3 moons. Who is him? Moses. It's the only other time you have the phrase, looked, saw that he was good, so she hid him. And in that case, the good would apparently mean just what we've suggested. That as an integrated whole, this child saw that he was good. Couldn't be a moral term. Must mean, what would the mother be looking for if she's going to defy the Pharaoh's order that you kill them all? The child is whole and complete and, as we were saying a moment ago, and now viable. This is a viable child, whole, complete. This child can survive. The illusion is unmistakable. So, absence of good to good, good to very good. Where's the first not good? Where's the first not good in Scripture?
Adam's loneliness?
It's in the 2nd chapter, absolutely. Where in the 2nd chapter?
it is not good that the man is alone.
That's right. Please look at Genesis chapter 2, verse 18. first absence of good is the second day of creation. The first very good comes at the close of the sixth day of creation. But the first not good is intriguingly embedded in that second chapter of Genesis, which so many people tell us, oh, it comes from a different source, it's an entirely different story, it's unrelated to Genesis 1. I don't think so. This kind of subtle interweaving of text is too interesting to discount as an accident. What did you want to add?
I'm sorry, I have to go to choir, but I want to ask my question.
Yes, please.
And that is, does the writer of First Genesis envision creation as continuing now? You just said completion is part of the goal of being good.
Yeah.
Is the implication of the word good in chapter 1 also an implication that the writer considers creation complete, no more creation?
I'll tell you why I think, intriguingly, that might not be the case.
Good.
And that's next week. No. No, here's why. If you look at the last verse in what is usually assumed to be Genesis 1, which is actually chapter 2, verse 3. Then God blessed the seventh day, made it holy, because on it rested from all his labors that God created. And the last word in the verse is entirely unnecessary and grammatically wrong. That God created should be the end of the verse, period, right? The last word in the verse, and I don't know what your translators have done with this, but it's a problem, is an infinitive. That God created, and then it says to do. That God created to do. And it has been suggested by, I think, very thoughtful critics of Hebrew Bible, that to do alludes in some way to God's investment in an ongoing process that doesn't end with initial creation. That God created to do is the way in which the Hebrew Bible describes creation in process.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. I want to go back, however, thank you. All the best to the choir. I want to go back to this first not good. Here's the deal. I, for one, am comfortable concluding, as I said a moment ago, that this aspect of the juxtaposition, 1 and 2, is not accidental. And it goes a long way toward establishing a very fertile underlying linkage between the texts. There's a lot that's different between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 about creation. But this one overlapping expression gives me pause. In this sense, it is striking that the first not good in the Hebrew Bible is aloneness, loneliness, abandonment, and isolation. It is entirely a human need that stands at the center of what is not good. That would emerge as the primal not good. It's not Satan. It is really striking that we don't meet someone or something at this point that is the embodiment of not good. It's not Satan. It's not sin. It's not over-regulation of the free market, for God's sake. Whatever you want to see as not, that's not it. What's not good is that a human being be all alone in such a world. That is striking. The first primary contradiction of God's purpose is a human being alone. I want to say one more thing about that verse. We're going to come back to it next time and begin with nakedness. So, you can't go wrong. Right? Next week is nakedness. Let me say one more thing about that verse because I want to talk about gender next week as well. It's pretty clear that what is being described in Genesis 1, when the human being is described, is a single human reality that the word human in that verse means all human beings of all genders, and that the narrator is struggling to explain how, given that Hebrew has singulars and plurals, masculines and feminines, one word can describe all people, singular and plural, masculine and feminine. That is the challenge posed by the language of the creation of the human being in the first chapter. We're going to come back to it next week. Here's the interesting thing about the creation of gender in the second chapter. So let's look at the verse carefully. Then God said, not good, lo tov, not good for human beings alone. I am going to make, and here it's not the word create, I am going to make an ezer kenegdo. Ezer kenegdo. And I hope you'll excuse the violence of the metaphor if I say from this point on, I hope we will have forever driven a stake into the heart of those folks who ever have the temerity to use this verse for sexist purposes. There's only one thing you need to know about this expression. There are lots of things you need to know about this expression. One thing for this morning. Ezer means help. Kenegdo means corresponding. A corresponding help. When you describe a helper in English, when you use this word ezer in English, do you think of the dominant or the subordinate member of the relationship? Is the helper the dominant or the subordinate member of the relationship? Subordinate tends to be, right? I help somebody, seems to say, Mama's the little helper. All of those ways in which we use helper, an aid seems to be somehow subordinate or secondary to some kind of primary. That's what happens to the word help in English. Now, if ezer is the root, and we have names in the Hebrew Bible like Eliezer, God is my helper. El-Azar, God helps. Azariah, God is my help. If we have those names, what do you immediately learn about help and helper in biblical Hebrew? It's switched. The help is the dominant member of the pair, not the subordinate member. It couldn't be otherwise. You could never have those, Ezra, you could never have those names in biblical Hebrew if it meant God is my little helper. That's not what it means. And the use of this verse to suggest as much is just, it's somewhere between tragic and criminal. So I want to relieve you of that problem. And just point out that if you have doubts about it, that it's a fluke, I think it's important to note where the verse ends. And then I'll just say a word about negatives. Verse 24. The genders come into being. Okay, that's why a man, and here the gendered term man and not human is used. That's why a man will leave his mother and father and cling to his woman, and they become one. Now what's interesting about that verse? That's why a man will leave his mother and father and cling to his woman. You would imagine, right? If you follow the second, right? If you follow should I just go? If you follow the typical sexist reading of the verse, you would have told yourself already it's the other way around, right? That's why a woman leaves her family and clings to a man, right? The verse says, no, no, no. That's why men leave their family and cling to a woman. It reiterates the notion that at the very least, men and women are equal in their gender. A helper that corresponds is far more likely a helper who must be constrained to be an equal than a helper who is subordinate to a dominant member of the parent. The first possibility is far and away much more in keeping with the language itself.
Putting those two words together, it seems that another suggestion or overtone is that the help that can be provided is precisely what is needed.
Right, exactly. It's not part of your crew. It's not a member of your staff. Okay. Here's where I'd like to pick up next week. I'll just tell you about the next characteristic. I'm sorry, the last characteristic on your sheet. Remember this. The Hebrew Bible is rife with puns and wordplay. They're all over. And of all of the characteristics of biblical storytelling, this is the one that, of course, is most difficult to trace in a second language. The biblical writers and narrators use wordplay repeatedly. And it plays a key role in many narratives. For this reason, not only is it entertaining, but it allows for the realistic iteration of the complexity of our own experience. Things in our own life rarely mean one thing. To be human is to live in a world of ambiguity, and wordplay expresses that ambiguity. So here's the ambiguity that I want you to think about next week. Translators have saved you from this ambiguity until today. And now, with this ambiguity, I think a biblical narrative that we'll study next week will suddenly become much, much more interesting. The Hebrew word for naked, used at the end of chapter 2 of Genesis, as in the two of them were naked, is exactly identical to the Hebrew word in the next verse that is traditionally described, translated as sly or shrewd. It's the same word. The quality that the human beings are said to have had at the moment of their coming into the world, conventionally translated as naked, is the same word as the quality the snake is said to have had immediately before it approaches the human beings. Can human beings be naked? Can they be shrewd? Can snakes be naked? Unlike many animals, they get naked every once in a while when they take off their skins. No. And can they be shrewd? Far more interesting undertone of this story is, what really is it that draws the snake to the human being? And what does the pun suggest about what we have in common all along? So, that's for next time.